Howdy do, neighbor. It's Berean Spirits time once again. The boys have gathered around and they're ready for you. So join in, make comments, and study with the guys as they try to study as the Bereans did in Acts chapter 17. And now, here's the guys.
Welcome to another episode of Berean Spirits here on the YouTube, Facebook, and all the social media. And of course, if you're listening to us on a podcast, we appreciate that as well. Be sure and share it out. Let everybody know about the Berean Spirits. My name is Chris Peltz. I am the evangelist with the Southside Church of Christ here in Springfield, Missouri. And we've got Josh Thornhill with the Brookmead Church of Christ over in Johnson City, Tennessee. Josh, how you doing today, brother?
I am good. I am good. I'm kicking. I'm doing good. I'm good.
I'm kicking, just not near as high.
Yeah. Years ago, we were at one of the church members' house when I lived in California, and my brother, he's like, "Hey, watch how high I can kick," and kicks his leg up, and then his plant leg fell out from underneath him, and he falls on his back, and we all just had a good laugh.
Yeah, that's crazy. That's crazy. Oh man. I tell you what, my wife is going to be going for her black belt here in another month, and the thing she's been doing is kicking. She's been doing these tornado kicks and jumping up and spinning and kick. It's crazy. It's crazy. All these, I'm just like, I'm getting out. I'm getting in the other room.
My sophomore year, my history teacher, he goes to the board and he writes the letter A on the board about eye level. And then he turns around and he's just like, "Well, I'm looking at the A," and we're just like, "What are you talking about?" And then he turns around and roundhouse kicks that A on the board. So yeah, watch out for your wife.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Be attacking.
We've got Richard Dodson. He's not kicking near as high either. He's with the Kearney Church of Christ up in Kansas City or Kearney, Missouri. Richard, how you doing today, man?
I'm good. Everything seems to be hunky-dory. Everything's up to date in Kansas City. Well, I guess it's kind of, city's kind of down a little bit this morning after the shooting at the Chiefs parade, but yeah.
Yeah, that is too bad. It's terrible when that kind of thing happens. And I know at this point, what last I heard, there was one deceased and 22 that had been shot. Is that still the case? Do you know?
Something like that. There's some of those that are hurt are in critical condition.
Yeah,
but she was a local DJ, and it appears that there was two young boys, looked like teenagers, and then some adult male that were arrested. But I don't know if they're going to be prosecuted or not. But I know that there was one of the boys got tackled, and his gun came out. So I don't know much about it. I just know it's a unfortunate thing. I do have a question though. And I'm not trying to get political, but I mean, there's so many people now that after this, and it happens on every shooting where they start saying, "We got to get the guns." And I was telling my wife last night, I said, it just seems kind of funny to me that there are places where people have guns where this kind of thing never happens. And so we want to take their freedom away, because of what happens in places, like what happened here in Kansas City and other places. And I was sitting there thinking about it, I guess because it hit close to home, but I thought, how come nobody ever yells to get rid of driving or alcohol when somebody is killed by a drunk driver? How come they never say, "We're going to come and take the beer"? They never say that. But if somebody gets shot and killed, they say, "We're going to come take the guns." And you can apply that to everything. I mean, if you start applying it to everything, pretty soon which I'm all favor for them taking the beer. But, uh, if you apply it to everything, then pretty soon you don't have nothing left.
I will say, that I've I've had a firearm on my person in the midst of a bunch of people, and nothing's ever happened. So it must not be the gun itself; it's the gun in the hands of evil people. That's what it is.
Well, that's just
And,
it.
and
I mean,
instead of addressing the evilness of the
yeah.
people, they want to attack or take away the tool.
Yeah.
And if they take away the gun, it's just going to be another tool that they use to commit their evil.
It just strikes me is that we won't, we don't want to take away the alcohol when somebody kills somebody drunk driving, but yet if somebody kills somebody with a gun, we want to take away the guns.
Yeah, there's two things with that. First of all, I know the mayor got on of Kansas City was like, "Listen, we had 800 police officers and they couldn't stop what happened, because it only took a few seconds." And you know what he was getting at. But you're right. I mean, Josh made the point. It doesn't deal with the issue of the people, right? The people are the problem, and that's always been the case, right? The people have always been the problem. Real quick with the alcohol, it's interesting though. There are so many dry counties. I don't know about Missouri anymore, but I know Tennessee has several dry counties where the sale of alcohol is illegal. And so there are places in the US where that is the case, where alcohol sales are banned. In fact, Lynchburg, Tennessee, where one of the most famous alcohols is made, is a dry county. You can't sell alcohol in that county. And so there's, they just go somewhere else to get it, right? I mean, people cross county lines and they go somewhere else, or state lines, and they get it some other way. People are going to do what they want to do. And that's where we have to address the issue, which actually leads pretty good into our topic of the day. And that is living with someone who is not faithful, because again, people are going to make their own choices, their own decisions. And, we have to get to the heart of the matter, which is the heart of the people. And so that's really what we need to talk about and get to today. And I think, as we get into this particular subject, I know a couple of passages that'll be brought up, at least I would assume would be 1 Corinthians chapter 7, as well as 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. And that's probably where I would start, unless you guys have something, else you want to say on that, or another starting point as we get into this particular topic.
Yeah, go right ahead.
So in 1 Peter chapter 3, we have a situation where first of all, he begins with likewise. And so it goes back to some things that were said in 1 Peter chapter 2, probably going all the way back to verse 18 of 1 Peter chapter 2. But nevertheless, here is a woman who is living with an unfaithful husband who even appears to be abusive in some respects, at least perhaps. But nevertheless, he's not faithful. And God gives instruction to her about not only being submissive to him, but doing so in view of eternity, first and foremost, doing so to glorify God. Everything that you do in word or deed, right, you are to do to glorify God. And if he won't listen to your words, make sure your actions don't contradict anything that you would or would have said, but make sure your conduct is chaste. Make sure your conduct is that which would show Christ living in you in every aspect of your life, so that even without a word, you might win them over to Christ. In other words, let the power of the gospel in your life work on the heart of others. And I think that's ultimately kind of where we'll end up in this discussion, but I think it's a good place to start as well. Richard?
I just think it can be an extremely difficult trial for any Christian to have to go through when a family member or loved one, someone you live with, is not obeying Jesus Christ because they're acting selfishly. I mean, they're looking to live their life the way they want to live it, and they're looking to satisfy the desires of the flesh. And so, because of that, it's a conflict that takes place, and so it makes it very, very difficult. And I'm talking about, for instance, a wife who lives with a husband who's a drunk or a gambler. That can be very, very difficult. You might have children that are extremely rebellious, and perhaps the mother or father is not doing their part in disciplining the children. There's various scenarios. You might have a wife who is extremely hard to get along with for whatever reason, and so Christians, they face this. This is something that's a problem that they deal with all the time because they can't get themselves out of that predicament unless there's sexual immorality, for instance. You cannot put away an unfaithful spouse. You're going to have to try to be the best mate that you can be. But how can you do that? How can you fulfill your duties to God when that person is, you know, taking advantage of you? I mean, that makes it very difficult, and they're not working toward the good of the family, and so that makes it an extremely difficult situation.
Yeah.
And so living with those outside Christ, that's not always the simplest thing to do, and that's probably, for me as an evangelist, I probably get more questions about that than from Christians than I do any other thing. And that is, how do you remedy one particular situation? That's the purpose of this show. Now, I will say up front, I've told my son this. While there's no guarantees, you really need to be careful about who you marry. You really do. Because if you're devoted to God, you're going to want a mate that's going to be as devoted as you are. And you want to make this a mutual effort toward having a God fearing home, God fearing family, and each one's going to respect their role as God has given them. That's the ideal. And if it's not ideal, then like I told my son, run away from it because in my experience, um, marriage is either one of the best things on this earth or it's one of the worst. And unfortunately, many times, many people are experiencing the worst while they're trying to live faithful and to be able to someday be in heaven. And because of that burden, we need to, as brethren in Christ, try to find a way to help them bear that burden. And that's the point of the show today: is
Yeah.
what can we say from the scriptures that will help you endure this burden?
One of the things that I think it's easy to do is become reactionary, and that's a very real danger when you have someone who is not faithful, who isn't doing what they can with the best interest of the family in mind, is to become reactionary. But Josh, when you look at these situations, when you have someone unfaithful in the home, their unfaithfulness does not change your responsibility. You have a responsibility in the role that you are in, whether it is a husband, a wife, a child, a parent, and God is to be first in that responsibility, in that relationship. And trying not to be reactionary, as difficult as it is, it's vital, because when we begin to react, our conduct becomes dependent upon those around us rather than our relationship with God.
Right. We do find, you mentioned the passage there in First Peter about the husband who's won by the chaste conduct of his wife, even without a word. You also find the First Corinthians where, if a man has an unbelieving wife, he is not to depart from her, and if she has an unbelieving husband, she is not to depart from him. And he says in verse 14, the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her husband. And so, there is still a responsibility that you have to, be a Christian and be a godly example to those kinds of people. This kind of lesson is kind of, um, I guess, close to me because I know of a very real situation where this is the exact situation that somebody is in, and I get almost daily messages, talking about how hard it is to live godly, to do what's right, and to maintain faithfulness when you've got a spouse in the house that is, I'm just going to say toxic, because that's exactly what it is. That's toxic. That will not do what God wants, and is actually vindictive, and will try and stand in His way of doing what is right. I mean, I know of very real circumstances, and I'm sure that's not the only one. And he constantly is telling me about how difficult it is uh, to have the right attitude, to have the right heart, to be faithful, to serve God in the way that He wants to, when he's got this constant toxic influence right there in front of him. And going to what Richard said, we've got to be very careful before we enter into any kind of relationship with people of the world, but especially if it's a romantic relationship like marriage. That's something that you don't want. And I think there's probably a lot more of this kind of thing than maybe we realize, um, because I think, for years there's been a tendency to, you know allow children to just date whomever, and then they get married, and then they succumb to the influences of their unbelieving spouses. And there's
Like
something.
Solomon,
What's that?
like Solomon.
Yeah, exactly. Those warnings are there for a reason, and so it's extremely difficult to live righteously and godly when you're surrounded by such an intimate influence as that. and,
But
and so
it's not impossible.
it's not impossible, no, and that's why you have passages like what we've already discussed, where you can do so, but it just makes your life so much more difficult. And if you want to, get to heaven, then that's not the best choice to make. Surrounding yourself with that kind of influence all the time.
But there are sometimes choices are made before you become a Christian.
Yeah.
And even if you're a Christian, sometimes choices are made, before you're mature enough to make such a choice, and you're not even offered much spiritual guidance in that. And so, there's a lot of people. Listen, I can remember when I was in high school, I had friends that I loved dearly who, once we graduated high school, we stuck together. But I had noticed they were starting to become more immoral, but I was growing as a Christian. And I finally reached the point where I decided I cannot keep growing as a Christian and keep them as my friends. It was just becoming more and more difficult. And I had to put them away as far as my friends go. And, you can do that in that type of situation. Unfortunately, there are Christians who are married and who face the same, the same situation. They're having trouble continuing to grow as a Christian when, as you said, Josh, they're living in a toxic environment, but they can't leave that and be
Right.
pleasing to God. And
Mhm.
so that makes it difficult. And so they go looking for answers. And of course, they come to preachers wanting to know, what the scriptures teach. And uh, I will say this right up front. Uh, if someone is living with that type of problem, the best thing that they can do, if there's elders at the church in which they belong, you need to go talk to them. You need to inform them about what you're facing and the problems that you're, going through, because they should, if they are qualified elders, they should be able to give you sound advice and be able also to help you, through prayer and other means, encouragement, things of that nature. But they need to know that you're going through this. And so that's part of it, is, tell the elders what you're going through. And then secondly, I think, and this is where many people, I think they just missed the boat. Christians are a people that walk by faith. And we have to be willing, as 1 Peter 5 teaches, we are to cast all our anxieties upon the Lord. So, I mean, this is obviously something we can't handle ourselves. We need to put this in the Lord's hands. And the best way we can do that is by obeying God, but also taking it to Him in prayer and allowing our brethren to also help us in that prayer. Now, the Lord, He's not going to allow you to be tempted more than you're able to bear.
Well, and that's where I was wanting to go there with Josh here in just a minute, but go ahead.
Well, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, Josh had brought that passage up a few episodes back. It's probably been a little while, but he had an explanation to that I thought the way that he put it was really good and in a better understanding, rather than just he. And I don't know if you remember, Josh, because a lot of people look at that and almost rely upon their own strength from that passage. But you had a great way of explaining that. Do you remember?
Yeah, one thing that I think is important about that verse is it's talking about temptation. And so no temptation, and I think the point is no temptation that you experience is too much for you to bear. Now, I think what we end up doing is we apply that to other situations in life. God's not going to give you more than you can handle. We tell them when somebody loses a loved one, especially if it's unexpected, well, God can't give you more, won't give you more than what you can handle, which isn't helpful, because I've heard of somebody who lost a child and they say, well, I don't want to be strong if that's the case. But regardless, you look at someone like Job. God allowed him to come to the very end of himself. And sometimes He allows us to come to the very end of ourselves because He wants us to trust in Him. He may allow us to bear a situation that is more than we can handle, but it's not more than He can handle. And that's why we lean on Him to help us get through it. And so, I think in all things, we lean upon the Lord and allow Him to guide us and to strengthen us, because that's the only way we're going to make it through anything, whether it's temptation or the various hardships and trials and struggles that life will bring. So.
Yeah. I mean, trials bring about temptations, right? I mean, the trial that we're talking about brings about the temptation to turn away from God, to give in to the worldliness or whatever it is, right? And so it's one of those situations where turning to God and relying upon Him and not ourselves. I mean, that's, that way of escape. He's it. And I think that's sometimes something that is missed as well.
Mm-hmm. A couple of years ago, I was driving and I was going somewhere that I'd never been before. So I had my GPS on, and I tend to have my GPS to where it doesn't give me the voice, turn left here, because I just don't want to hear that all the time. And so I just kind of watch the thing. And when it says to turn, then I go ahead and turn. Well, I was on the phone and I wasn't paying attention to the GPS. And then I just happened to see, oh yeah, that was my exit right there. And how often do we do that with temptation? That way of escape is there, and we just blow right past the exit without noticing it, without taking advantage of it. And it's one of those things where we don't have to sin, and the only reason we choose to we sin is because we've neglected the way of escape that God has given us, the means of overcoming it. And so
Yeah.
we
So,
are.
Richard, if you have more on your thought, go ahead. I didn't want to interrupt necessarily, but
No, I mean that was you can't. He explained very well about the way of escape. But that's what we need to be doing is putting our faith in God
Mhm.
and living Christ-like. Now, a good example of one who lived with evil, but he did not exhibit faith, and that is Eli. Eli had a responsibility toward his children. His children were evil. Had two sons, and they were just horrible people. But yet he did not restrain them. And the Lord held him responsible because he did not restrain them. Now, why didn't he do that? He had a duty toward doing that. Uh, uh, but instead of having the Lord with him, he had the Lord against him because he wasn't taking care of the very thing that he could have done. And I think that's what we need to be looking at. What do we need to do? And Chris, you went to First Peter 3 with the woman that had an unbelieving spouse. To be that example, to be constantly being that person that where that person can see Christ. That's what we need to be focused on. And again, I mean, I know that there's going to be disappointments. You may live with a gambler, and he may come home and he may have lost, all the rent money. He may have lost the grocery money. And I know that's extremely frustrating. I know how hard that can be. But again, we have to walk by faith. We have to cast our cares upon the Lord, and the Lord will work through the problem. But we can't take matters into our own hands and start thinking we can do things our way. I don't know why Eli didn't restrain his children. Maybe he just loved them too much to be able to do that. I don't know. I know, like in First Corinthians chapter 5, the church there was supposed to, uh, to
discipline.
discipline a man who was in sin, and they didn't. They for whatever reason they glorified in it. And you take that same principle into the family. Sometimes that can happen. We can start thinking so highly of our loved ones that we do not carry out the commands of the Lord, and in so doing, our prayers are hindered.
Yeah.
And so we don't have the Lord helping us in that. And so the first and foremost, you need to do is you need to walk by faith and do the things that are pleasing to God, and then let God work on your problems
Yeah.
because He'll do it. He will do something.
So there are a couple of things that you said, and I understand what you mean. When you say Eli, maybe he loved them too much. Hebrews chapter 12, actually, God says, if you don't discipline, then you don't love them at all.
Love them in the
Well,
wrong way.
Yeah, right. Yeah, love them, and you're right. That's true. But at the same time, look at Samuel. Samuel's sons were evil as well. The people didn't like them either because they weren't much better, it would appear, than Eli's sons. But it does appear as though Samuel, did things differently than Eli, and which brings me to the point that people often have said, and they've told me, I mean, I've in these situations, I've had someone come to me and say it didn't work or it doesn't work. And I want to make this very clear. God's way always works. All right. Now, the problem is sometimes what we view as working isn't God's view of working out and being, the right or the same results. Sometimes the results are different in what we consider what has worked and what hasn't. that woman in 1 Peter chapter 3, if she does what God says to do, whether he comes to the Lord or not, it worked because she saved her own soul in being faithful and just before God. And so it worked, right? She did what she was supposed to do. We can't force the gospel on anyone. It is their choice, their decision they have to make. But God's plan works. If not, in as we view it in the lives of others, it's worked in our life and in our relationship with God.
And another good example to bring up is Joseph and his evil brothers. They sold him as a slave because of their jealousy. Joseph and his father had a special relationship that they were jealous of, and they sold him as a slave. And as a result of that, there was suffering on the part of Joseph. I mean, you can only imagine, the trip into to Egypt. I mean, how scary that must have been for someone, who's being, sold. But then, at one point he's in jail. And, you can imagine the discouragement that he was going through. And this all happened because of evil brothers living, in his house. And of course, at the end of the story, if you go toward the end of the story of Joseph, Joseph reveals that the Lord had a plan and he was using his brother's evil to bring about a greater good. And Joseph understood it at that point. So that's something else. Chris, this goes along with what you're saying. That is something we have to recognize. You may be carrying around a horrible burden, but by you carrying that burden, we don't know what the plan of the Lord is. Your faithfulness while you endure this burden may be bringing about a greater good that you're not aware of. And so we have to have faith in God. We have to have faith in the Lord. And but like I said, too many times we take matters into our own hand, and you see people, they start thinking, well, I'm going to get a divorce.
Mm.
I can, and the Bible doesn't give me authority for it, but the Lord surely doesn't expect me to stay married to this person. This is not joyful, and I've heard all types of scriptures that try to justify that. One man said that, I heard this one, about the wife that, it's better to be in the corner of a housetop than with a,
Contentious woman.
yes, somewhere in Proverbs, I think. But needless to say, that he used that as a reason that he could get a divorce, which that's he's looking, he's just grasping at straws. Now we can't do that. We're going to have to keep our head together, and we're going to have to think, well, listen, if I have to carry this burden, like Peter's, he had the thorn in the flesh. If I have to carry this burden, then so be it. That's the will of the Lord. And I'm grateful I can serve the Lord this way.
Yeah.
That has to be our attitude. That's part of walking by faith.
Yeah. And that's the difficult part in our lives, right? I mean,
Hey,
people want to make it easy.
Christianity is not hard. Not easy. There is nothing about Christianity that's easy. It is a hard thing to come from a life of sin and to train your mind to live righteously. That is a very difficult thing to do. But the rewards, boy, they're great. I mean, it far outweighs what's going to happen to those who don't try.
Yeah. Josh, go ahead.
And I would add to what Richard just said, when you have two people that have the same outlook, that have the same goals, that are working together to serve God, to be righteous, to encourage one another, to build up one another, and to work together and walk together toward heaven. It's hard enough like that.
Yeah.
Just considering all the influences in the world around us, that's hard enough. And when you have, somebody who's actively pulling you down, that just adds a whole new degree of difficulty. And so, I guess, you had mentioned something about the elders and how the elders need to know the struggles that you're facing if you are dealing with something like this. The church is supposed to be family. And I think there's a lot of congregations where people are just mere acquaintances. And we wonder why discipline doesn't work, right? Because there was no relationship there to begin with. But we need to be more than mere acquaintances, and we need to be family. And we find songs like "Blessed Be the Tie" and "How Sweet, How Heavenly," when each can feel his brother sigh and with him bear a load. I think that's how it's worded. I may be missing the last word there. Each can bear a sigh, or whatever. The point. The idea is we weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. And we need to have an environment where brother so-and-so or sister so-and-so who is in a circumstance like this can come and share their burdens with her spiritual family and not get an "I told you so," but get "we're going to walk beside you. We're going to encourage you and support you. And we're going to love you through this struggle. And we're here for you." And that can go a long way in strengthening somebody in the midst of such a circumstance. We need to be there for one another and I think part of our American culture with this rugged American individualism is so contrary to the scriptures. It's not what God wants. God wants a community of people who have all things in common, and not like some kind of socialist commune or something, but people who share their burdens with one another and who love each other and are going to strengthen each other and help each other through the different circumstances that they face. That's the goal that we need to work toward within our congregations of God's people.
And if I can add to that, and this doesn't happen often, but I mean, if someone is having trouble, let's say they're married to someone who's not, who's, I mean, they're just a mean person. They're not doing the things they need to do. Well, how many Christians then, evil companions, corrupt good morals, we talk about that. But also our influence can also influence others for good, as we see in 1 Peter 3. The wife can influence the husband. Well, why can't members of the church try to be a good influence on that non-Christian? In other words, why can't I go to this man whose wife is a sister in Christ, and he's, being a burden for her? Why can't I go to him and say, "Hey, let's go fishing." And while we're fishing, we can talk about spiritual things as I try to build a relationship with him to where I can teach him to try to influence him for good. And if it's not just me that's doing it, what if there's other men in the congregation that's doing it? We're helping that sister carry that burden, and we're trying to bring about change. And again, like all too often, we don't do that, but that's something that I think that we need to really get involved with the burdens that our brothers and sisters carry in this, because it can be too much. I mean, it really can be very, very hard. Hey, we got a comment here. Let's start going through this. Thomas Thornhill, never heard of him. This is Josh's dad, by the way. He goes, I heard a preacher one time say, and I use it: if you marry an unbeliever, you're going to have problems with your spiritual father-in-law.
The
And,
devil.
huh?
It's the devil.
Oh. And he says, while applied to marriage, it can also apply to others whom we associate with. And he goes on, he says, the sad reality is there are associations you cannot avoid, but when you do have a choice, are you choosing wisely?
Yeah, that's a great point.
That
Yeah.
is a good point.
Yeah.
And if
You
I
know,
could,
Romans 12, points out, preferring one another. And I think you guys have both made just a tremendous point in the respect that being a family of God, right? Too often preachers are looked at almost as outsiders, right? You've come into this area, you're not from here, and you're probably going to leave in a few years or whatever. And it's more difficult sometimes for preachers to become a part of the family, and and which is unfortunate. And it's a great benefit when that's not the case, when the preacher is just as much a part of that family in every aspect, and in every way, because it makes it easier to do all the things that you guys have talked about, being able to have an influence on the family members of others, being able to have that communication and work on that influence that you can have with them. And that's what it's about, showing Christ, right, over everything else, putting God first and making sure that we're doing all that we can to uh, to illustrate the love of God both in our lives and the love that he has for them as well.
Mhm.
Richard, last thoughts?
Yeah, go to some of the wisdom books. There's whatever your situation is, a lot of times there's these little one line verses that are great words of wisdom that you can apply to your situation. For instance, I found one, Proverbs 15:1, a soft answer turns away wrath, but harsh words stir up anger. That's something to keep in mind when you're having problems with an unbelieving mate. So, there's little things like that in the wisdom books that can, kind of give you some keys on what you can do to help yourself in your situation.
Yeah. Josh, last thoughts?
I want to, when we read through the gospel accounts, we can think about Peter and how impetuous Peter was at times. And the night that Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper, they're in the upper room with the observing the Passover, and Jesus says, one of you is going to deny me, and Peter's like, if I have to die with you, I'm not going to deny you. He's in the comfort of his friends. He's around the people. He's in the presence of the Lord. When he's standing right there with Jesus and can touch him, it's easy for him to say, I will die with you rather than deny you. But what happens when he's off by himself? He's all by himself and he denies the Lord 3 times. And so, influences matter. And so going back to this comment that was made about the associations you do have a choice with, you are the sum of the 5 people that you spend the most time with. And if they're not godly people, you're not going to be as spiritual as you need to be. It's just not going to happen. And so we need to make the wise choices and make, the song Take Time to Be Holy. I think a crucial part of that is make friends of God's people if you want to be holy. And so those are my last thoughts.
Yeah. Well, folks, we appreciate everybody who tunes in. Those who've made comments, we appreciate that as well. Share out the program. Let others know about what we're doing here on Berean Spirits every Thursday morning. And until next time, remember to search the scriptures with Berean Spirits.
Well, folks, that's all for today. Don't worry. Lord willing, the guys will be back next week for another Bible study on Berean Spirits. Until then, let the guys hear from you. Drop them some email at bereanspirits@gmail.com. They'd love to hear from you. Until next time, let's keep studying that Bible.